Arthur Blake wasn't the kind of man you'd notice in a crowd. In his late 40s, with thinning hair and a slightly hunched posture, he seemed every bit the unassuming janitor. By day, he kept to himself in a small apartment on the south side of Chicago, a modest home lined with second-hand furniture and old books. By night, Arthur became part of the city's financial machinery, the silent custodian of one of Chicago's busiest banks. He cleaned the floors, emptied trash bins, and ensured everything was in perfect order for the suits who would take over in the morning. "He's reliable," the bank manager had once remarked. "Quiet, efficient, no complaints." Arthur had been working at the bank for almost 10 years, and in that time, he had earned everyone's trust. Nobody gave him a second thought as he pushed his cart down the dimly lit halls late at night, the smell of cleaning solutions wafting in his wake. But Arthur had secrets, and secrets, when nurtured in silence, have a way of festering. One late shift in the fall of 2006, Arthur's life took an unexpected turn. It was a quiet night, the kind he preferred. He was wiping down the bank's main lobby floor when he noticed the branch's assistant manager hurrying out the door. In her rush, she left something behind, the key card she used to access the ATM vaults. Arthur picked it up, intending to return it, but a strange thought crossed his mind. What if I kept it just for tonight? Arthur shook his head, trying to dismiss the idea, but curiosity is a powerful thing. After finishing his routine duties, he found himself standing in front of the ATM service room, the card clutched in his hand. For years he had walked past those locked doors, wondering what was inside. Now, he had the means to find out. Sliding the card through the reader, Arthur felt a surge of adrenaline as the door clicked open. Inside, rows of machines loomed in the darkness, their screens glowing faintly. These weren't just cash dispensers. They were vaults in their own right, filled with thousands of dollars in neatly stacked bills. Arthur didn't take anything that night. He told himself he was just curious, that it was harmless. But the seed had been planted. Arthur's life wasn't what he had envisioned as a young man. Once he had dreams of becoming a teacher or a writer, but life, as it often does, got in the way. A series of bad decisions and unfortunate circumstances had left him trapped in a cycle of dead-end jobs. The janitor gig was steady, but it barely paid enough to cover his rent and the mounting medical bills for his ailing mother. His co-workers at the bank knew nothing of his struggles. To them, Arthur was just the janitor, a man who faded into the background. But Arthur had a sharp mind and a knack for observation. He had noticed things over the years, like how the ATM system worked, how the machines were loaded and serviced, and most importantly, the bank's lax oversight. "It's not stealing," he muttered to himself one night, pacing his apartment. "It's just borrowing." The decision wasn't made in a moment, but rather over weeks of sleepless nights. When Arthur finally acted, it was with the precision of a man who had spent years planning, even if he didn't realize it. It was a Tuesday night, just after midnight. The bank was silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning. Arthur unlocked the ATM vault using the card he had kept and opened one of the machines. His hands trembled as he pulled out a small stack of bills. $40, just enough to go unnoticed. Stuffing the money into his pocket, Arthur closed the machine and left the room. For the rest of the night his heart raced, every sound making him jump. But when morning came and no alarms were raised, he felt a strange mix of relief and exhilaration. Arthur soon discovered that the bank's ATM logs weren't as meticulous as he had feared. As long as the discrepancies were minor, they went unnoticed during audits. This realization emboldened him. Each night, he took a little more, careful to vary the amounts and machines. "Don't get greedy," he whispered to himself like a mantra. He used the money to pay off overdue bills and buy his mother's medication. But he also indulged in small luxuries, a new jacket, better groceries, a trip to a second-run movie theater. For the first time in years, Arthur felt a sense of control over his life. What made Arthur's scheme so effective was its simplicity. He didn't tamper with the machines or hack the system. He relied on the trust the bank had placed in him and the institution's own inefficiencies. And because he was so unassuming, nobody suspected him. But Arthur couldn't shake the nagging fear that his luck would run out. He began noticing things he hadn't before. a security guard lingering too long near the ATM room, a manager double-checking the logs. Was it paranoia, or was someone onto him? One night, as he sat in his cramped apartment counting the money he had taken, Arthur thought about stopping. He had already stolen several $1,000s. Wasn't that enough? But the thought of returning to his old life, scraping by on his meager salary, was unbearable. Things took a turn when a new assistant manager, Rachel Carter, joined the bank. Rachel was sharp and detail-oriented, the kind of person who thrived on solving puzzles. One evening, as she reviewed the ATM reports, she noticed a small discrepancy, a missing $60 that hadn't been accounted for. "It's probably nothing," the head manager told her. "Just a logging error." But Rachel couldn't let it go. Over the next few weeks, she began tracking the ATM transactions more closely. One night, as Arthur finished his shift, he noticed Rachel watching him from across the lobby. She smiled politely, but there was something in her eyes, something that made his stomach churn. As he walked out into the chilly Chicago night, Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet life was about to become very, very loud. Rachel Carter was new to the bank, but not to the world of finance. At 32, she had already built a reputation as a meticulous analyst in her previous roles. When she joined the Chicago branch, she was eager to prove herself. The ATM logs, overlooked by most of her colleagues, became her project, a puzzle that no one else seemed interested in solving. $60 here, 40 there, she murmured, running her fingers down a column of numbers late one night. Too small to notice, but it's happening too often. Rachel wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but something didn't sit right with her. The discrepancies were always minor, but they were too consistent to ignore. Her instincts told her it wasn't a technical error. Meanwhile, Arthur Blake was growing bolder. Over months, his nightly withdrawals had become a routine. He had refined his methods to avoid detection, taking small amounts and alternating machines to prevent patterns. His quiet demeanor remained unchanged, a perfect mask for his secret life. "No one suspects the janitor," he would think to himself, chuckling softly as he wheeled his cleaning cart past the very machines he had emptied hours earlier. With each successful night, Arthur's confidence grew. He even allowed himself small indulgences, a better suit for church on Sundays, a rare steak for dinner. But he was careful not to draw attention to himself. His co-workers barely noticed the changes, and those who did assumed he had gotten a raise or a second job. But Rachel noticed something else entirely. Rachel began digging deeper. She reviewed security footage from the nights when discrepancies had occurred. At first, it seemed like a dead end. The ATM room was secured, and no unauthorized personnel were seen entering or leaving. But one detail stood out: the janitor's cart. Arthur's cart, always parked in the same spot near the ATM room, lingered in the footage for longer than necessary on certain nights. Rachel couldn't prove anything, but the coincidence gnawed at her. Could it really be the janitor? She muttered to herself one evening. The thought seemed absurd. Arthur was a fixture at the bank, a man everyone trusted, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow involved. One fateful night, Arthur made a rare mistake. Distracted by the growing tension at work, he forgot to properly lock one of the ATM machines after taking a modest $80. The next morning, the error was noticed by a technician, who reported it to the management. "It's probably just a one-off mistake," the head manager said dismissively, but Rachel seized on the opportunity. "Let me handle it," she volunteered, determined to dig deeper. Arthur sensed the shift almost immediately. Rachel had started lingering in the office late at night, poring over reports and footage. Her polite smiles had been replaced by scrutinizing glances. One evening, as Arthur emptied a trash can near her desk, she struck up a conversation. "Long nights, huh?" Rachel said casually. Arthur nodded, keeping his answers short. "Yeah, part of the job." But Rachel pressed on. "Ever notice anything unusual while you're working? Anything out of place?" Arthur forced a laugh. "Not really. Banks are pretty quiet at night." The exchange rattled him. That night, as he stood in front of the ATM room, card in hand, he hesitated for the first time in months. "Maybe it's time to stop," he whispered to himself. But the thought of giving up the money, the power it gave him, was too much to bear. He opened the door and continued his routine. Rachel's investigation was starting to gain traction. She compiled weeks of footage and logs, creating a timeline of every discrepancy. The pattern became clearer. The missing amounts always coincided with Arthur's shifts. Armed with this information, she approached the head manager. "I think we have a problem," she said, laying out her findings. The manager was skeptical. "You're saying the janitor is stealing from the ATMs? That's a serious accusation, Rachel." "I know how it sounds," Rachel replied, "but the evidence is there. We need to act before it gets worse." Reluctantly, the manager agreed to let her continue the investigation, but he cautioned her to keep it quiet. "We can't make any accusations without solid proof," he said. Unaware of the full extent of Rachel's investigation, Arthur began to unravel. Every glance, every conversation at the bank felt like a veiled threat. He started double-checking his work, erasing his tracks with meticulous care. But paranoia is a thief's worst enemy. One night, as he walked home from his shift, Arthur noticed a car following him. It was an unremarkable sedan, but its presence sent his mind racing. Are they on to me? That night, Arthur didn't sleep. He sat in his dimly lit apartment, the stolen money spread out on his kitchen table. "Maybe it's time to quit," he muttered, running his hands through his thinning hair. But quitting meant returning to the life he despised, a life of scraping by, powerless and invisible. The tension reached its peak when Rachel convinced the bank to install hidden cameras in the ATM room. Arthur had no idea he was being watched. 1 week later, as Arthur entered the ATM vault to make what he thought would be another unnoticed withdrawal, the cameras captured everything. Back at her desk, Rachel reviewed the footage, her heart pounding. She finally had the proof she needed. "This is it," she whispered, picking up her phone to call the manager. But Arthur wasn't done yet. As Rachel prepared to confront him, he was already planning his next move, one that would shock everyone at the bank. The day began like any other. The bank hummed with the usual activity, clients filtering in and out, tellers chatting in low tones, and the muffled whirl of printers. Rachel sat at her desk, sipping coffee while glancing at her laptop. She'd spent the night reviewing the hidden camera footage again, ensuring there was no room for doubt. "Today's the day," she murmured. Her heart raced with anticipation. She'd built an ironclad case, but confronting Arthur Blakov, a man everyone trusted, felt surreal. In the manager's office, Rachel laid out the evidence. "We've got him," she said, pointing to the time-stamped footage. "The thefts, the patterns, it's all right here. He even used his own access card to enter the ATM room." The manager sighed, rubbing his temples. "This could blow up in our faces if we're wrong, but if we don't act, it'll keep happening. Let's call security." That evening, Arthur entered the bank with his usual calm demeanor. The air was cold and his breath fogged as he wheeled his cleaning cart through the lobby. The security guards gave him a nod, just as they always did. Unbeknownst to him, Rachel and the head manager were watching from the control room. "He's sticking to his routine," Rachel whispered. Arthur moved methodically through the building, emptying trash cans, wiping surfaces, and replacing supplies. To anyone else, it looked like the diligent work of a seasoned custodian. But Rachel's eyes were glued to the monitors, waiting for him to make his move. When Arthur reached the ATM room, he paused. His hand hovered over the access card in his pocket. A wave of doubt washed over him. "Am I being watched?" He shook his head and swiped the card. "Paranoia's getting to me," he muttered under his breath. Inside the ATM room, Arthur worked quickly. He retrieved the device he'd modified to bypass the machine's alarms and opened one of the units. His movements were swift but deliberate. He'd done this dozens of times before. In the control room, Rachel's pulse quickened. "He's doing it," she whispered. The footage showed Arthur removing cash in small, precise stacks, slipping them into his cleaning cart. The manager grabbed the phone. "Call the cops," he said. But Rachel stopped him. "Wait, let's see what he does next." Arthur finished his routine and left the ATM room, pushing his cart toward the exit. He felt lighter than usual, almost giddy. But as he approached the lobby, his instincts flared. 2 security guards stood near the door, their eyes locked on him. "Evening, Mr. Blake," one of them said, stepping forward. Arthur forced a smile. Evening. Mind if we take a look in your cart? The guard asked, his tone polite but firm. Arthur's stomach dropped. It's just cleaning supplies, he said, gripping the handle of the cart tightly. Still, we need to check, the guard insisted. In that moment, Arthur made a split-second decision. He shoved the cart into the guard and bolted toward the side exit. The quiet bank erupted into chaos. Alarms blared as the guards pursued Arthur through the corridors. Rachel and the manager watched the scene unfold on the monitors, their eyes wide. "Call the police!" the manager yelled. Arthur sprinted through the building, his mind racing. I can't get caught. Not like this. He knew the layout of the bank better than anyone, and he used it to his advantage, weaving through hallways and ducking into maintenance rooms. But the guards were relentless. They cornered him near a fire exit, blocking his path. "Arthur, it's over," one of them said. "Don't make this worse." Arthur's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. His breaths came in sharp, ragged gasps. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. By the time the police arrived, Arthur was sitting on the ground, his back against the wall. The stolen cash was scattered around him, a silent testament to his guilt. Rachel stood in the lobby, watching as the officers handcuffed Arthur and led him away. His face was blank, devoid of the quiet confidence he'd always exuded. As they passed her, Arthur looked up. "It wasn't about the money," he said quietly. Rachel frowned. "Then what was it about?" Arthur's lips twitched into a sad smile. "You wouldn't understand." The night ended with Arthur in custody and the bank in turmoil. Rachel felt a mix of relief and unease. She'd solved the mystery, but Arthur's cryptic words lingered in her mind. Back at her desk, she stared at the footage one last time, replaying the moment Arthur walked into the ATM room. There was something in his expression, something she hadn't noticed before. "What were you really after, Arthur?" she whispered to herself. The story was far from over. Arthur's arrest was just the beginning. The police investigation would soon uncover secrets that no one at the bank had anticipated, secrets that would cast doubt on everything Rachel thought she knew. The day after Arthur Blake's arrest, the atmosphere at the bank was tense. Employees whispered in hushed tones, exchanging rumors about their once-trusted janitor. Rachel sat at her desk, reviewing her notes for the police. The events of the previous night played over in her mind. Arthur's cryptic words, "It wasn't about the money," kept gnawing at her. "Rachel, the police are here," the manager called from his office. She gathered her documents and joined Detective Marcus Hayes and his team in the conference room. Hayes, a sharp-eyed man in his early 40s, wasted no time. "You did good work catching him," he said, nodding at Rachel. "But this case just got a lot bigger." Rachel frowned. "Bigger? How?" Hayes leaned forward, spreading crime scene photos across the table. "Blake wasn't just stealing from your bank. We've found connections to at least 4 other institutions in the area. Same pattern, small, calculated thefts over several years. But here's the kicker. Most of the money's unaccounted for." While Hayes and his team combed through the evidence, Rachel couldn't help but dig into Arthur's past. She learned that Arthur had lived alone in a modest apartment on Chicago's South Side. Neighbors described him as polite, reserved, and dependable, a man who always paid his rent on time and kept to himself. But as Rachel delved deeper, she found cracks in the facade. Arthur had no family in the area, and his social circle was practically non-existent. His only known hobby was tinkering with electronics, an interest that now made sense, given how he bypassed the ATM's security systems. One detail stood out. Arthur had worked at a tech company in his youth but was abruptly fired after an internal investigation. The reasons were unclear, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that it was connected to his current crimes. Meanwhile, at the police station, Detective Hayes sat across from Arthur in the interrogation room. The janitor looked weary, his hands cuffed in front of him, but his demeanor was calm. "Let's cut to the chase, Arthur," Hayes said. "You've been stealing for years, but this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision. You planned this. Why?" Arthur smirked faintly. "Why do you think?" Hayes leaned back in his chair, studying the man. You were meticulous, careful. You could have stolen millions in one go, but you didn't. Instead, you took just enough to stay under the radar. So, I'll ask again. Why? Arthur's smile faded. He looked down at his hands as if weighing his next words. It wasn't about greed, he said finally. It was about justice. Justice? Hayes echoed, incredulous. Arthur nodded. You think these banks care about people? I watch them destroy lives. Families losing their homes, small businesses crushed by fees and penalties. And for what? To line the pockets of CEOs. So you decided to play Robin Hood? Hayes asked, skeptical. Arthur didn't answer. Back at the bank, Rachel received a call from one of the detectives. We've been reviewing Blake's financial records, the officer said. He hasn't spent a dime of the stolen money. No extravagant purchases, no hidden accounts. Rachel was stunned. Then where's the money? That's what we're trying to figure out, the detective replied. As the investigation continued, a surprising lead emerged. Several local charities had received anonymous donations over the years, donations that coincided with the timing of Arthur's thefts. The amounts were small enough to avoid scrutiny, but significant enough to make a difference. One recipient, a homeless shelter on the south side, described the donor as a man who wanted to stay in the shadows. The director recalled how the money had helped them expand their services during tough times. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that Arthur hadn't acted alone. The level of sophistication in his methods suggested outside help. Her suspicions were confirmed when the police uncovered emails on Arthur's computer. The messages were encrypted, but they traced the IP address to a former colleague at the tech company where Arthur had worked decades ago. Detective Hayes confronted Arthur with the evidence. Who's your partner? He demanded. Arthur's expression hardened. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play dumb, Arthur. We found the emails. Someone helped you pull this off. Arthur remained silent, his gaze fixed on the table. The partner in question was identified as Michael Reeves, a reclusive tech genius who had once been Arthur's mentor. When questioned, Reeves admitted to teaching Arthur how to bypass ATM security, but denied any involvement in the thefts. I didn't think he'd actually use it, Reeves said, shaking his head. Arthur always talked about how broken the system was, but I thought it was just talk. Do you expect us to believe you didn't profit from this? Hayes pressed. Reeves sighed. Look, I'm not saying I'm innocent, but Arthur wasn't doing this for himself. He wanted to make a point, to show that even the most secure systems have vulnerabilities. He saw it as poetic justice. As the investigation unfolded, the case grew more complex. Arthur's actions painted him as both a criminal and a vigilante. His meticulous methods and refusal to spend the money suggested a deeper motive, one that went beyond simple theft. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that Arthur had planned for this moment. The cryptic clues he left behind seemed almost deliberate, as if he wanted someone to uncover the truth. But one question remained. Why did Arthur choose to strike now, after years of operating in the shadows? As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, it became clear that Arthur's story was far from over. His arrest was just the beginning of a larger plan, one that would shake the banking industry to its core. Arthur Blake sat in his holding cell, a faint smile playing on his lips. To the untrained eye, he appeared defeated, but Detective Marcus Hayes knew better. Something about Arthur's calm demeanor suggested that he was still in control. Meanwhile, Rachel, now fully invested in the case, met with Hayes at the station. There's something we're missing, she said, laying out her findings. Arthur wasn't just stealing money, he was making a statement. But what's the end game? Hayes nodded, rubbing his temples. We've got the donations, the tech connection, and his meticulous planning, but none of it explains why he let himself get caught. Their conversation was interrupted by a junior officer, who handed Hayes a file. This just came in. It's a request from Arthur to speak with Rachel, alone. Rachel hesitated. Why me? He seems to think you'll understand, Hayes replied. In the sterile interview room, Rachel faced Arthur across the table. He looked tired but composed, his eyes betraying a glimmer of satisfaction. "You wanted to see me?" Rachel asked, breaking the silence. Arthur nodded. "You're different from the others. You ask questions, dig deeper. That's why I chose you." "Chose me for what?" Arthur leaned forward, his voice low. "To finish what I started." Rachel's breath caught. "What are you talking about?" Arthur smirked. "Do you think this is just about money? It's about power, control. These banks, they destroy lives while hiding behind layers of security and bureaucracy. I wanted to show them that even their most secure systems could be breached. And now, I need you to tell the world." Rachel frowned. "Why me?" "Because you saw through the facade," Arthur said. "You saw me as more than just a janitor. You have the voice to expose the truth." As Rachel pressed him for details, Arthur revealed the true extent of his plan. The thefts were only the beginning. Using the money he had stolen, he had quietly funded a network of activists, whistleblowers, and tech experts to expose corrupt practices within the banking industry. "I've been laying the groundwork for years," Arthur said. "Donations to charities, funding investigations, building connections. Every dollar I took was a step toward dismantling the system." Rachel's mind raced. "But why turn yourself in now?" Arthur's smile faded. "Because my part is done. The system's weaknesses are out in the open. Now it's up to people like you to take it further." While Rachel mulled over Arthur's words, Hayes interrogated Michael Reeves, Arthur's alleged accomplice. Reeves finally cracked under pressure. "He's playing you," Reeves said. "Arthur wanted to get caught. He knew it would draw attention to the case. He's a strategist, always thinking 3 steps ahead." "What's his end game?" Hayes demanded. Reeves sighed. "He wants the public to see the banks for what they are, untouchable giants with feet of clay. By exposing their vulnerabilities, he's forcing them to answer for their greed." Hayes leaned back, piecing the puzzle together. Arthur wasn't just a criminal, he was a provocateur, using his arrest as the final act in his elaborate plan. News of Arthur's arrest and his Robin Hood-style theft spread like wildfire. Media outlets painted him as both a villain and a hero. Protesters gathered outside the bank demanding accountability for years of predatory practices. One protester held a sign that read, "Arthur Blake, the man who exposed the system." Rachel, now inundated with calls from reporters, struggled to decide how much of Arthur's story to reveal. She knew the truth would spark a firestorm but feared the consequences of staying silent. As public pressure mounted, the bank's executives scrambled to contain the damage. Internal audits revealed more than just Arthur's thefts. Evidence of unethical practices, hidden fees, and predatory lending came to light. One evening, Rachel received an anonymous tip. A USB drive was delivered to her apartment, containing files that exposed the bank's darkest secrets. The files were encrypted but bore Arthur's unmistakable touch. She called Hayes immediately. "Arthur planned this," she said. "Even from behind bars, he's pulling the strings." Hayes wasn't surprised. He wanted a spectacle, and he got it. But now we have to decide what to do with this. The case against Arthur culminated in a high-profile trial where he pled guilty to theft, but remained unapologetic. "I may have broken the law," he told the court, "but the system was already broken. I just held up a mirror." Arthur was sentenced to prison, but his actions left an indelible mark. Public outcry forced the bank to overhaul its policies, and other institutions faced increased scrutiny. For Rachel, the case became a defining moment in her career. She published a series of exposés, detailing Arthur's life, his motives, and the flaws he sought to expose. As for Arthur, he faded into obscurity, content with the knowledge that he had shaken the system to its core. His legacy lived on in the conversations he sparked and the changes he inspired. Sometimes, to break the system, you have to work from the inside. Sometimes it takes a janitor to sweep the floor clean. The story of Arthur Blake, the janitor who outsmarted Chicago's banking elite, left an indelible mark on a system that prided itself on impenetrability. Though his meticulous theft landed him behind bars, the aftershocks of his actions reverberated far beyond his cell walls. In the years following his arrest, the banking industry faced unprecedented scrutiny. Arthur's heist was no longer viewed as a simple crime, but as a symbol of defiance against unchecked greed and systemic corruption. Public protests and media exposes brought the banks to their knees, forcing them to implement reforms to rebuild trust with their customers. For the first time in decades, the people had the upper hand. Arthur's trial became a media spectacle. Dubbed the Robin Hood of ATMs, he stood unrepentant before the court, delivering a final statement that cemented his place in history. "I didn't steal for myself," he said, addressing a packed courtroom. "I stole to show the cracks in a system that steals from everyone else. My crime wasn't the theft, it was daring to expose the truth." Though sentenced to 10 years in prison, Arthur's story didn't end there. From his prison cell, he became a mythic figure, an unlikely hero for activists and whistleblowers worldwide. His carefully orchestrated plan, unveiled piece by piece during the trial, was studied not just by law enforcement, but by ordinary citizens inspired by his audacity. Meanwhile, Rachel Connors, the journalist who uncovered the depths of Arthur's scheme, became a household name. Her investigative series on the heist earned her accolades, but more importantly, it sparked a broader conversation about financial inequality. Rachel's exposés didn't just tell Arthur's story. They pulled back the curtain on the banking practices that had quietly bled consumers dry for decades. Detective Marcus Hayes, once obsessed with catching Arthur, found himself in an unusual position. While he prided himself on solving the case, he couldn't ignore the broader implications of what Arthur had done. "I thought I was chasing a thief," Hayes admitted years later in an interview, "but I ended up catching a mirror." As for the banks, the fallout was catastrophic. Forced audits uncovered unethical practices, from predatory loans to exorbitant hidden fees. CEOs resigned under public pressure, and government regulators imposed stricter oversight. The genius janitor heist became the cautionary tale that haunted boardrooms across the country. Arthur Blake's name became synonymous with defiance, a modern-day Robin Hood who used his broom and his brain to challenge a billion-dollar industry. While his actions were illegal, his motives sparked a revolution. Even today, his story lingers, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon is a simple, overlooked man with a plan. And in the end, the janitor who swept floors taught an entire industry a lesson it would never forget. The genius janitor heist isn't just a tale of theft. It's a story about dismantling power, one ATM at a time. Swing his life took a surprising turn. Sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, he quickly became an inmate legend, respected for his ingenuity. Using his time wisely, Arthur became a mentor to younger prisoners, teaching them financial literacy and writing letters advocating for systemic reform in banking practices. Released early for good behavior, Arthur now lives quietly in a modest Chicago neighborhood, occasionally lecturing on cybersecurity and ethics under a pseudonym. Rachel Connors, the journalist who broke the story, saw her career skyrocket. Her exposé on the heist earned her a Pulitzer Prize, and she parlayed her newfound fame into a role as a financial reform advocate. Her book, Swept Away: The Janitor Who Cleaned Out the Banks, became a bestseller and later inspired a Netflix documentary. Detective Marcus Hayes, once the relentless investigator of Arthur's scheme, experienced his own reckoning. His involvement in the case earned him a promotion, but the moral questions it raised stayed with him. Marcus retired early, shifting focus to consulting on financial crimes and teaching investigative methods. The banks involved in the heist faced heavy fines and were forced to overhaul their ATM protocols. To this day, Arthur's name lingers in boardrooms as a cautionary tale.